Related. Here.
Right. Welcome back. We are here with Jason, and we did not finish your presentation. We didn't get a chance to do your rural economic development presentation. So we are all ears.
Thank you.
You met us all last time, I believe, and introduce yourself and take it back.
Thanks. For the record, I'm Liz Gleason. I'm the Farm and Forest Viability Program and Rural Economic Development Initiative Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Sharing it.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was.
Okay. There we go. All right. So yeah, last time, a couple weeks ago, Gus gave the overview along with Polly of all of the HCB's work, which I know you all know pretty well. I'm here to talk about two of our rural economic development initiatives, and I'm going to start with our Farm and Forest Viability Program. I have been working in this program for 14 years, and before that worked on a bunch of different farms across Massachusetts and North Carolina. So this work is really near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to share about it with all of you. And if you have any questions, please jump in. I think I have about like 20 minutes of slides, so no, you don't need to go back. We have plenty of time. Okay, well now my PDF is not advancing. Here we go. So we have been conserving farms at the HCB for about 15 years when we started what was then called the Farm Viability Enhancement Program, which was set up by a coalition of people and with a lot of direction and input from the legislature, from the Senate Ag Committee, House Ag, and others. And basically, we've been making a big investment in the conservation easements, but we're realizing that there was a lot more to do to support farmers. It's a really, it's a tough market to be in. It's a really international market. Even the smallest farmer in Vermont is really impacted by this being a really international market, whether it's for dairy or other crops. So we started a business development program that would work individually and really in depth with those businesses to help them improve their management skills. The goal really being that the businesses in Vermont that are working the lands can last longer, be more profitable, have a take-home income for them, their families, pay their workers well, do great land stewardship, and actually like succeed in this economy. We work with all different kinds of businesses, from big dairies, conventional and organic, to really small scale farms. The only folks we generally don't work with are people who are right in the first couple of years of startup.
Questions?
Yeah.
You sort of invited a few things.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, do you, in your criteria in evaluating where you're going to commit your limited resources for conservation, easements, acquisitions, and so on, do you factor in proximity to city services as well as development patterns and adjacent parcels? Is that a dominant factor that you would be disinclined to want to conserve for farming purposes lands that are close to housing that's existing?
It's not so much disinclined. Every agricultural conservation project that we look at, we also assess whether or not there's an opportunity for housing. So our conservation and our housing teams are in communication when there's a place, and usually that's only when there's something close to existing development where there might be a part that like doesn't actually make a lot of sense to conserve for agriculture when it's super close to services. So I'm not sure if that's getting at your question. Sometimes we do have great farmland really close to downtown, but it's important to conserve those really good soils.
And I can speak to that a little bit. Polly, for the record, Polly Major, Policy Director of the HCB. Part of the process of the conservation easement application, when the lot is adjacent to a settled area, is to reach out to the town and ask the town if this is an area that they support conservation on, whether it's an area that they're looking towards development for, and will work with the landowner and the town if they want to carve out a section for development. There's a property in South Hero we did that for last year.
Do you simultaneously consider input from statewide stakeholders regional planners and so on, or is it really just up to the town and municipality in which the land resides in?
I think anyone who would
Yeah.
reach out to us would be considered.
Do you have a lot of deference to the town that the parcel's in, or do you give equal deference to like the regional planning committee as well as state stakeholders?
I'm not sure I can speak to that.
We
and
can
how it's
definitely
weighted.
follow up with you on that though. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so Farm and Forest Viability Program doesn't just work with conserved farmers. We work with folks who are considering conserving, not interested, who are actively in the middle of conserving. It's really across the board. We have a network that I'll tell you about in a couple of slides of about 15 different farm and forest business advisors, all of whom have run their own business in the past. So they have a lot of that production experience or had like significant management within another and working lands business. So they bring the financial management, they bring all the business skills that you need, plus having actually like the experience on the ground. So we find that really valuable. We
Just given the number of farms that have closed since I've entered the legislature, it's just astonishing. I think there were over 1,200 farms when I first entered the legislature, and we're now down.
yeah, dairy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the number of
What-
dairies is
how many farms do you credit for having actually kept from going under? I mean, all of these support systems
Yeah.
have huge impact on preserving our farming industry. I mean, can you look to how many you've actually sort of saved, as I would, I guess? I mean, I don't know how else to
Yeah,
ask.
well, no, that's a great question. I will say that we do a lot of transfer planning, which is one of the most vulnerable with succession planning, you know, when an exiting generation wants to retire, looking for that incoming generation. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's not. Either way, it can be very vulnerable. And we do really significant evaluation with the folks that we're working with. Last year, everyone that we worked with on transfer planning did say, like, we consider this program to be a reason that we are not closing this year. And you'll actually see that stat on the slide in the future.
I am interested in policy and structural barriers to that transfer. Someone mentioned to me this week, the capital gains tax on selling your farm, and if we could reduce or forgive components of that for, the promise of keeping it in agriculture.
Yeah.
Has that come up? Are there, you know, I don't know, maybe you're getting to slides about how we
No,
can help with farm transfer.
I do not have a slide on the capital gains tax. I will say that considering taxes, considering Medicare, considering estate planning and end of life care is part of what we do support people with, and we'll match them up with lawyers and help pay for an initial meeting or two with an attorney or with a tax planner to help navigate all of that stuff, whether it's capital gains tax or other, you know, taxes from profit. Those are things that we support people in figuring out how to make the most strategic decision. Farmers generally are land rich and cash poor, and as we've seen this like incredible jump in land values, that is something to think about for sure. So I hear that.
I'm working with Ag on a bill, and you
Yeah,
can get your barriers ready to share it there.
I would love to learn more about that bill. Is that with Heather Stubenhunt or? I'm
Lovely. I mean,
transfer.
I'm working with Joe Major and Heather Scholdice, and some former legislators.
Yeah, I'd be curious to learn more. Yeah, so succession planning is a big one. That can be tricky and complex, and we help support both the exiting generation and the entering, and often do a lot of like work around land access and how to actually afford to get onto land, walking through people through that access to capital, sometimes even like going to meetings with the lender for folks who are building that those management skills. We work with about 100 to 150 farm and forest businesses every year. Last year, we worked with 108 folks, like really in-depth over a multi-year program. And those 108 clients were generating over 42 million in sales and had about 300 jobs. So we do work with really small people, sometimes even part-time farmers and forest businesses up to like, I would say medium to large for Vermont businesses. Yeah.
I also I've also been hearing a lot about how our on-farm accessory business
Yeah.
legislation that we put in our bill out of this committee last year did not quite meet the mark or achieve what we needed it to, so that people can do classes and, have a cafe or whatever they need to do on their farm to make it viable.
Yeah.
Are you hearing, and I'm also hearing a lot about local regulations that
Yeah.
may be superseded by state law that doesn't allow them to be as heavy-handed with farm because they're being.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I'm ready to talk about like how we make them viable. Like, I'm sorry.
And
Like,
you may be addressing that because that's certainly an issue for us to be
Yeah.
looking at. So
I will not speak to that particular legislation. I will say that our primary focus is on building management skills. All of these things do come up. Policy matters a lot to farmers and forest businesses in terms of the skill set of our program and where we focus. It's on how do we do your financial planning? How do we make sure you're able to pay yourself and your employees? How to become more profitable? What do you want this business to look like? How do you take care of the land? Like that is more of our focus. Obviously, we work with a lot of people who are intersecting with all of these issues. And I think for some farmers, that aspect doesn't come up for them because they're not doing that kind of business activity. And there are some people who are like having to parse out, like, did this t-shirt I sold with my farm's name on it count or not?
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So it's a really wide range. And yeah. Just to speak to profitability a little bit, that's one of the primary things we try to support people on. Agriculture and forestry is typically not a super high margin business. So making sure that you're as profitable as you can be to take care of the land, take care of your people is really important. We measure pre and post sales and profit and net income throughout the course of our program. And I looked at the last couple of years and we saw an average increase of 36% in profitability. So we're feeling really positive about that. This is Honeyfield Farm in Norwich. This is a great example of a successful farm transfer. We have a lot of businesses that have been built up over time, have a lot of clients, have a lot of infrastructure, have a really strong base in their community. This was one of them, and they were struggling to find the right successor for that business. We had been working with Eli Hirsch, who's on the left in the red shirt. He'd been working at Riverberry Farm up in, I think, Fairfax for many years and incubating a little veggie business there. And they really wanted to grow and expand. So we worked with Eli and his partner Valerie when they were looking for land. And when they finally made a match with this exiting farmer. So they've grown their business a lot from when they had a little thing going up at Riverberry. They're doing amazing things. They have a lot of community events. They do a lot of plant sales. They do wholesale. And during COVID, we gave them a small grant to buy a delivery truck. So they were actually making home deliveries in the beginning of COVID when no one knew how to react to any of it.
and when was the transition of this?
Oh gosh.
It was before COVID or
It was before, yeah. It was maybe like 2018, 2019. I could be a little bit off there.
Right.
And you'll see in these bubbles on the right, just some of the sort of indicators we use. We focus on some really holistic metrics of success around quality of life and stuff like that. But these are the more sort of by the numbers effects. So we're really seeing a growth in sales on average of $45,000 growth last year. And the clients that we worked with in 2024 accessed over 5 million grants and loans. And I'm seeing it's 11:15, so I might like scooch through some of mine a little bit faster, but if you have any questions on anything, let us know. Just quickly settling us in the numbers, agriculture is a $1 billion a year industry in Vermont. Forest products is about 1.3, 1.4. There's 6,500 farms in Vermont. Only 3,000 of those are selling over 10,000 in product. We have seen a dramatic decrease in dairies, nowhere near as dramatic and in fact semi-consistent around other business types. So we work a lot with businesses who are trying to diversify, change their production. Cow dairies transitioning to goats or adding maple or that kind of thing. So definitely helping folks work through that. We've worked with a total of about 1,500 businesses since the growth.
So just if I interrupted, just
Yeah.
go back to the accessory on farm business opportunity. How many of your farms, I mean, are you not helping them with that? Because that's who is helping them with that?
It's not
if you're
that- It's not that we're not helping them with that. It's just that we are not typically in the details of the policy development. So yeah, we work with a lot of people who have accessory on farm businesses and we help them run the numbers on it, figure out what scale it should be, help them assess their product lines, how much is it going to cost to develop that as a business enterprise. It makes sense for some people and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
for
sure.
So yeah, definitely involved, but not as much on the policy as we are on the implementation.
But I think it's interesting, the $10,000 amount, because another proposal request that I received was to really significantly reduce the reporting requirements and the tax requirements under $10,000 of farm income, because you're probably unable to grow if you're just paying for the bookkeeping and things for that amount. So that's another part of our proposal.
Yeah, and those businesses really are quite small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And typically very part-time.
Yeah.
And is Ag taking that up?
Yeah.
Good.
I mean, I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. We do everything in partnership. I mentioned those 15 different people. They are staff at these 5 partner organizations. So they're embedded within agricultural and forest industry organizations. So that's how our program gets delivered on the ground. Our team does the enrollment and the management. And we also work with lots of other amazing partners in this space. I already talked a little bit about farmland access, so I won't go deep on this slide, but I will say Mama's Farm in Williston, we worked with them to move from the Pine Island Community Farm in Colchester to a new farm in Williston where they've been able to grow. Baird Farm, this is an example of an intergenerational transfer from the older generation who wanted to retire to one of their kids. And this is where you'll see all of the clients we worked with on the transfer planning last year felt like the support of farm and forest liability would help their business continue. They wouldn't be closing during that transfer process. We do 2 different kinds of grants. One is a really targeted small $5,000 to $10,000 investment that folks can apply for after they've been through our program. They've developed a really comprehensive business plan with key implementation strategies. They can apply to us for a small grant. We're seeing a lot more activity in the sort of vineyard and winemaking space. We're working with a handful of vineyards right now, including Lamont and Wela and New Haven. So that's a really interesting and gaining popularity small vineyard. And Roots Market, which is in Middlesex, they have 2 farms that we've conserved, and they've worked extensively with us on business planning over the last couple of years. And we're also part of the state's water quality budget. So we run a water quality grant program that complements the Agency of Ag and MRCS.
Are you seeing a lot of synergies with agritourism and bed and breakfasts at these vineyards, as well as other opportunities for people to come and stay and live at a farm in Vermont for a week or so while an active farm? Is that happening?
Yeah, it's certainly happening. I wouldn't say it's like huge with the businesses that we work with. There's a lot of people who have a very small you're talking about bed and breakfast and like a stay feature. I would say that I don't see that as much with folks who are doing like full-time commercial growing, which is typically the people who are, but it happens a lot. It's just not as much a focus for a lot of the people that we're working with, but it's certainly a thing. I would see the other aspects of agritourism, like a farm store, or that kind of like more direct to consumer sales is much
Tasting
more
room
of a
of city.
thing. Yeah. Those. So Rural Economic Development Initiative, we call it READY. So Senator Starr worked really hard to create this program in 2017. We had been working with farms for many years to help them access a couple of key federal grants that are pretty hard to get. And we knew that they needed more of that help. And we also knew that it wasn't just farmers of all kinds of small towns, organizations and small communities that were really limited in their ability to access big federal dollars because they didn't have the experience, they didn't know what grants to go after, they didn't know how to write a grant. So Senator Starr and others created this really sort of specific small but mighty program ready to get in there and work with communities to say, like, what are the funding sources you can go after? Let me help you write this grant so you can put in a competitive grant. We work a lot with towns that don't have full-time staff or small nonprofits in small towns and working lands businesses. And our focus areas are downtown revitalization, community-based economic development, working lands, and outdoor recreation. This is Champlain Orchards and Shoreham, and they got a almost $240,000 USDA grant to expand their eco-certified apples, which is a really big line for them across New England.
So, sorry, just this amount, the over $1 million.
Yep.
You guys, what percent of that was state and what federal?
It's almost all state. There's about like 150 to 200 of USDA rural development in there. We're also part of the MTAP program, Municipal Technical Assistance. So there's a little bit of MTAP, like about 150 that's included in that 1 million. And the communities that we've worked with through this program have so far accessed $22.7 million for the projects. I think we have another 1 million pending right now. So we're really seeing people effectively draw down.
And this isn't individually appropriated to Ready, it's through the VHCB.
Yes.
And your choices of how to invest the money that we send to VHCB. So this is a good example of umbrella VHCB. You've seen a lot of the housing investment, but here is another piece on their conservation side that is.
Yeah. Ready has
economic.
its own statute, where sort of across all of VHCB's work, not necessarily within just the conservation wing of the work. And historically, you were actually designated a specific dollar amount. We have moved towards generally considering that as part of VHCB's budget as a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
I am hoping you're one of the recipients of federal funds who's not worried about losing those dollars.
In this moment in time, we are fine. I will say that on the farm and forest viability side, we have been about 25% federally funded with individual grants that we draw down for our work from a bunch of different federal agencies. So we're certainly tracking it. Right now, we have a pretty big congressionally directed spending award that we received last year through the Small Business Administration. So we're hoping that that is not affected since it's already been approved by Congress and already have a signed grant agreement. Certainly looking at it. Okay for right now. But yeah, federal funding is a big mix of what allows us to meet demand for our programs. If we did not have federal funding, we would not be able to meet.
So of the 22 million, what percent of that is federal? Because
almost all of it.
yeah, I was gonna say, because this is leveraged a lot of money, but a lot of it is federal money.
Yes.
That was the
Yeah.
second part of it.
And I know without you and the conservation districts, there's a lot of communities that wouldn't know that there's a lot of USDA money available to them. So for now, it's not just, is it going to keep flowing, but you're doing great work making sure people know that it is available. And I think otherwise it's not advertised.
It's not being accessed.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know if they're how to actually get it.
okay, sorry, keep going.
No, it's good. It's good. I'm almost done with my slides. So
Water quality, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah,
That
well,
is certainly,
yeah, within the Rural Economic Development Initiative, a couple of the areas we've seen a lot of interest are in water and wastewater expansion, which I'm sure you hear a lot about as a something that can really hold up downtown economic development. So this picture on the left is a big press event for the Northern Border Regional Commission. Highgate and Swanton have collectively accessed 1.5 million for oh gosh, was it NDRC or maybe it was EDA? Anyway, a big water and wastewater improvement project there, a similar project in North Hero that will really improve infrastructure so that businesses in downtowns can effectively expand. We also hear a lot from rural general stores, which is a fun and interesting part of Ready. So this is the Sheldon General Store, which is in Newport. It's a beautiful old historic building. They worked with us many years ago to do sort of like a little funding map what are those federal and other resources available to us? How would we get them? How would we stack them? What's eligible for which grant? And then help them draw down $120,000 for part of their renovation, from federal funds. And the Albany General Store is another really great example. We worked with them very early on when they were doing renovation and fit up. A bunch of different funding had to come together for that to happen. But if you haven't been there, it's a really sweet little general store.
Right, where you, I assume, partnered with Preservation Trust and
Often
everybody
partner with
else.
Preservation Trust,
Yeah.
yes, for sure. And we also see a lot of interest from trail development. Bethel got a $330,000 for a grant for trail development. That would sort of connect the downtown to some really nice, accessible, easy to get to trails. I hear the community is loving those. I'm really engaged, and that project has gone well. A lot of childcare. So Pittsburgh Village Farm, I started working with them in around 2018 when they had a board of like 15 volunteers who were all like really excited about this. They didn't really know how to turn this kind of falling down building into something really useful. It has amazing trails. It's super beautiful. They've been renovating it, getting lots of money. And I believe there was just an article this morning in Digger about signing a contract with a childcare center provider. So really important to have that rural childcare as the one with two little kids who's surrounded by people with little kids who want to go back to work and they can't find childcare. We feel really good about making these.
How involved are you in the huge childcare center that at the end, speaking of exit, which we were chatting about earlier, at exit 4, the Randolph one?
I'm not sure. I'd have to get back to you on that one. I don't know. I don't think we are, but I could be wrong. I'll ask my coworker who runs this program about it. The Bridgewater Community Center, that was an elementary school that closed. And now they have a pretty active community center, and there's a childcare operating
Childcare right there.
Yep. So we helped them get a grant early on to make that shift in the space. And then Clemens Family Farm got a really awesome federal grant called Arts Place America about 6 years ago that helped them do a bunch of early renovations as they were expanding their art center there on the farm in Charlotte. So Ready has a really very broad set of businesses and organizations and towns that we're working with, but it's really all centered around how do we effectively draw down these really complex sources for volunteer-based and town-based projects that might not happen otherwise. These are just a couple of the other farm businesses we've worked with through Ready. Collectively, these two businesses got a little over $2 million in pretty competitive federal money. The Vermont Livestock Slaughter and Processing will triple their production, which will really help with all the great meat production we do in Vermont. Maple Brook Mozzarella makes a really delicious set of cheeses, and I got a Dairy Business Innovation Center grant with some support from our team. So I think that's it. Polly, did I miss anything?
I think so.
All right. Well, it's 11:29 now.
I think you're pretty spot on your. Any questions from Liz? Thank you for coming back and finishing
you
up
for
our
having me.
VHCB presentation, because
Thanks for what you're doing too.
Thank you.
Our food and timber security, I think right now is on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve how we're engaging in that conversation and how we're helping farms and forests stay viable.
Well, and to tag on to that, one of the most important things, I mean, as we look at this terrifying threat of 25% tariffs on our lumber, given the crisis we have in affordability on the inflation costs in
Yeah.
housing, building. What are you doing to help our forest products industry redevelop? Because we had them and then we closed them all, milling. How? Because we have the wood, we send it, most of it to Vermont, like 90% of it, to Canada, to be milled. What are we doing to make ourselves, protect ourselves and finish the milling and the work here to make it useful for our construction industry?
Yeah, it's really tough. I was talking about the International Market Forum. Timber is like even more subject to that than ag is. It's really vulnerable in that way. We've lost a lot of mills recently, some of the bigger ones.
How many do we have left in Vermont?
Oh gosh,
Not
I'm not
very
very sure. And there's like folks that are really tiny, and then there's folks that are just tiny. And we don't have that many of the more medium scale businesses. There's
I heard
people,
something like 30 to 35, and they're also just operations of a much smaller group of actual,
yeah,
mill businesses.
So what's negatively affecting those? So
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
a lot of things. Yeah.
We used to have a lot of cafeteria conversations to solve these things that I'm talking to one of our house agriculture folks on re-engaging.
It's a good question. There were costs, there were liability issues, there were.
There was
a bunch.
curtailing of operating hours that we worked on in this committee
Yeah.
a couple of years ago. I mean, things where people don't have the right to log and to mill, where people don't want to see or hear or experience real rural economic activity.
But I think we'd have to get our new commissioner or of forest parks and ag maybe hearing some of that. So I would ask our ag partners to hear some of that because
Danny
it's a
said-
real opportunity for us.
Address that better than I can, but it's a confluence of things, including. Yeah.
Thank you,
so
Liz.
much. Yeah, and if you have any other questions, let me know. And I do have hard copies of our annual report, which I'll also email all of you, but if anyone wants a hard copy, I've got some.
Thank you. I think we have your presentation. Is that
So I have
different
my
from your report?
presentation. It's different. This is our annual report.
For
have some of-
BHCB?
For the Farm and Forest Liability Board, we are asked by our wonderful statutes to also give you a report specifically on ready and Farm and Forest Liability. So this is it. There's some overlap to the presentation, but there's also a lot more stories.
Happy to see. Thank you very much. And more to follow.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. And now we're going to pivot to an aspect of this. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Excuse my reach, but it's fine. I want to knock everything over. Thanks.
I'm gonna stay sitting until you move back.
Probably today.
There we go. All right. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. Good to see you both. You want one of these or not?
Oh, yeah.
Chris,
Yes,
Chris Goldman.
thank you.
Key piece of our housing is our financing. We've heard some of it last Friday. Housing finance
Getting
101.
beautiful.
And we didn't have time to have you join them. And so Chris is joining us today to talk about banking and housing.
Sure, happy to be here. For the record, Chris Delia, President Vermont Bankers Association. Quickly, if you want to study an interesting model on agritourism, look at the country of Italy.
Yeah.
Agriturismos are an incredible experience.
Yeah.
For them.
The UV
They are,
effect.
well, they are here too,
Yeah,
actually.
I agree. It's just a great model.
Very familiar with.
Take a look at it. So,
Yeah.
Again, Chris Delia, President, Vermont Bankers Association. You've been hearing from a lot of folks in the housing arena, and happy to bring you the perspective of the banking industry. After some brief conversations with you, Madam Chair, and Senator Brock, I went back to our industry and just asked them a few questions that I'll share the answers with you this morning. And then I'd like to open it up because I'm sure you have a heck of a lot of questions for us, especially what's going on with rates and what we're seeing out there. In the bigger perspective, our industry is very concerned about housing, healthcare, public safety, workforce, climate issues. All of those are circulating right now in the Vermont economy. And the concern is less of an impact on our institutions, but more of an impact on our communities and customers that we're serving. It's also fair to say we're very concerned about this uncertain world we're in right now. There's a lot of changes that are happening at the federal level that will have an impact on the state of Vermont. You just alluded to some of it earlier in your comments about federal monies that come into our state, which, if the spigot were turned off, could have such a detrimental impact to our communities and citizens in our state. We're also watching closely what's happening in our world with regard to our regulators and change in new leadership in our regulatory institutions. I was saying to my members last week that I feel I ought to give them neck braces because we're in for the next round of whiplash with the change of policies that we may see at the federal level that govern the work that we do in our state as an industry. With regard to what we're seeing in the marketplace for housing, I think it's a fair statement to say it's kind of a tale of two locations. A lot of comments about the Chittenden County, Winona County, Franklin County, North Addison County markets, and then kind of everybody else. So what I was able to capture is some of that perspective. And if you're in that northwest corner of the state, most of the comments were they're seeing a lot of activity out there. Just drive around parts of Chittenden County and you see a lot of development that's going on. Those are typically larger projects that our financial institutions have actively bid on and are participating with various groups to make those happen. And then in other communities around the state, especially when you see the smaller projects out there, there's not a lot happening. And the primary reason that's the case is they're not penciling out. They are not projects that, from an appraiser's point of view, the appraisers are coming in, or the appraisal is coming in, and it is not supporting the development of that project. It's not meeting the needs of the lenders and the developers out there and others in order to make that project work. And I would encourage you, because I don't think you've done this, is I'd invite the appraisal community and just have a conversation with them about what they're seeing in the marketplace.
We had a half hour of that last year that really helped with the AMI question, like who's actually able to afford what and why our programs for middle income people are not even reaching those who could afford a house at these interest rate levels.
Right.
Yeah. So again, it varies depending on where you are in the state and what our folks are seeing for activity. I can assure you that if projects pencil out, there is availability of capital from our financial institutions. The rate's a different question or a different conversation which we can have, but the availability of capital is out there. And again, it's as long as the projects work financially. In Windham County, one of the comments that I got back was a little bit more of availability in the multifamily projects that they're seeing out there over the last few months. And then on the residential single family side, perhaps not as much. I'm just going to go through what they're seeing before I get into the difficulties of some of the development. So again, it's kind of a tale of two things that are out there. I was asked them if they're seeing any infill development. You folks worked a lot on ADUs. And the general consensus was that there is not a lot happening right now in the ADU market. It is, again, difficult to make them financially work. Projects that a lot of our folks are seeing tend to be more family oriented, where I'm putting an ADU on the property for an aging parent or a family member, but not from the commercial perspective of renting that out in the marketplace. I do have one bank that is exploring an ADU program with a group outside the state, and he's going to give me some information once they've had further conversations, but they were excited about that to see whether it might be something that we could look at here in Vermont. Many believe that ADUs are a very viable solution, but it's not going to get us to the scale that we need to accomplish.
One tool.
But it is one
tool.
absolutely it's one tool out there that folks look at, but it is a modest volume that they're seeing.
Yeah.
Then the question, yes.
I'm just gonna have to leave a little early, and Chris, if it's not part of your presentation now, I'd like to talk about it later, but I'm gonna be exploring a proposal to allow a project to continue developing while it's being appealed.
Right.
Apparently this might happen in Massachusetts, et cetera. And the big question is, how do you make someone financing the project comfortable? And I'm hearing something about the policy is remediation at the end. So you're pretty confident in what you're doing. You might have to pay on the back end for, actually helping the environment somewhere else or remediating somewhere else, rather than paying on the front end for costly appeal and delays in the project.
Right.
So if you could help explore that with me, that's, I think, where I would like to see the bankers come into the conversation.
I have counterparts in Massachusetts and Mass bankers that I'd be happy to have that conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
The other piece on ADUs that I think we have to look at is the tax impact, their property tax impact after it's completed. And the sort of the surprise a lot of ADU owner developers in my neck of the woods experienced, they did.
Right.
And so I would like us to also explore, as a further incentive to building an ADU, a tax incentive for the 5 years after it's developed. So I've got that.
Got it.
For us to
Obstacles, this will come as earth-shattering news to you, right? Permitting costs, appraisals, local resistance, infrastructure are all challenges that we would add to the list. I think the anxieties are a bit higher with, again, some of the policies that are occurring at the federal level, in particular, immigration policies and discussions. Worked with a roofing company this summer that the large majority of their workers are from El Salvador. They did an incredible job, but there is anxiety related to that as potential obstacles. The cost of materials, as you just alluded to in your conversations on tariffs, are still quite high out there and have added to the cost of developing projects. So all of those certainly add up the cost of infrastructure. And I look at this in two buckets, or we look at this in two buckets. It's not just the infrastructure that you need to advance the project that may not be in the ground now, but go to any community that's been in Vermont for however many years, decades, centuries. We've got aging infrastructure in Vermont that, how many water main breaks do we have in Montpelier in a given winter? That is not being addressed until something happens that we need to take a look at. So clearly, infrastructure development. You talked quite a bit over the last few years about Act 250, but we also hear the other permitting processes, water, stormwater, agricultural permits are all out there that can have an impact and delay projects and the time that it takes to get those permits in place. A big plug from our bankers from the perspective of working with the various partners out there, groups like VHFA, Housing Conservation Board, Rural Edge, and other locally community-based organizations that you're all too familiar with, that often our folks are involved with and work with to advance some of these initiatives. Put a plug in for the VHIP program, which you folks are again all too familiar with, and the great work that did to help get units back into condition that they're livable. The down payment assistance programs help to deal with those borrowers who are there. The cost of financing these days, just to put a bracket of numbers on it, what I got back from our members was anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5, 7.75% as far as interest rates go for commercial projects that they're involved with in the marketplace. I can go into what makes up that rate if you're not familiar with it already, but that's on average what we're seeing out there.
That's current. And where you anticipate it going?
So part of the meeting that I was at last week, we had a presenter who was focusing on economic policies, Fed policies, 10-year treasury notes, et cetera. And I asked him that very question, and he would anticipate seeing probably the 10-year treasury drop ever so slightly, which may bring rates down to more in the 6.5% range as an average versus higher. But there's so much uncertainty out there right now. We have a pause with the Fed on rate cuts. There's concerns about inflation. There's concerns about overall economy. There's concerns about workforce. So it is very difficult right now to predict where we think we're going to go with rates. But I can assure you, if it moves, it's going to be 25%, 50 basis points, 50 basis points. Not talking about going back to the days of 3%, 4%, 5%, not anywhere close to that I can tell. So let me,
those are also adding to our soft costs. I mean.
yeah,
they're all-
absolutely. I mean, the cost of capital, when you look at going from, 4%, 5% now up to 6.5%, 7% is not helpful. And that adds to the challenges that these projects are seeing out there. Quickly on the issue of lending rates, try and put it into this context. You've got Fed fund policy out there, right? We're at about 4.5%. We're going to be in this pause, if you will, for any possible cuts out there. But Fed funds typically deal with short-term borrowings in the banking industry. So you're talking about overnight fund for short-term. That means that's the borrowing cost for the financial institution. Then you've got to look at your overhead costs, your origination costs on top of that, any profit that you're building in. And that's the spread between your borrowing costs and what you're putting it out there into the marketplace for. The more important area to look at with regard to borrowing costs for mortgages, et cetera, commercial activity, is really the 10-year treasury. And that's what our folks typically peg their mortgage rates to. It's the same analysis. You're looking at where the treasury is, what it is in the marketplace, mortgage-backed securities, and then you're building in your costs and factors on top of that in order to lend it out into the marketplace. I've already alluded to concerns, and again, in the Fed discussions of a week or so ago, inflation is still a factor out there that they're concerned with. That's why we have a pause on interest rate cuts. It's a concern to our financial institutions as well, and seeing what happens out there. General economic factors are a concern. Workforce are concerns for us, and how that plays into the development of projects and the cost of that workforce. And then the other thing, which many people don't tend to focus on, but we do as an industry, is what's going on with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which have been under government control for the last decade plus. And are we going to see any changes in this current administration toward those two organizations? And that creates uncertainty in the market for us, because for a lot of our residential loans, if you are selling into that marketplace, that's often who you're selling to. So if there's uncertainty around their practices, now they're going to move forward, that creates challenges for us.
And what's the mix? I've actually not heard, but I'm not you. So
Sure.
what are you hearing that
But that's the problem, we're not.
maybe that's a good thing?
Well, it could be. I mean, maybe it's off the radar screen for this point.
That might
But
be a good thing.
it's been under government control for, since the 2008, 9, 10 timeframe.
Right.
So what can we expect as far as policies and changes within those organizations? Because it's such a valuable tool for our financial institutions to recapitalize. Make a bunch of loans, sell them to Fannie or Freddie, get that money back, re-lend it out into the community.
John, you have a question?
A topic that you didn't touch upon, and maybe your travels have intersected in the past, that certainly has very big role for bankers is
Yes.
something many other states are doing. This is a map of all the states that have now, what's called property assessed clean energy financing.
Very familiar with it.
Great. So Vermont is not currently illuminated on this map. And
Correct.
it is, there's some great success stories. It's allowed to have the note be held against the property independent of the owner.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this? Okay.
Yes, and actually the House is taking this up in terms of property
Lovely.
assessment.
Great. So I hope that we find ways that you would see your industry being supportive of this in other states, because it's an opportunity to lend capital.
Yeah.
So,
Great, thank you for bringing that up, because I think actually it will be part of our conversation.
yeah, we had discussions about PACE years ago
Okay.
in Vermont. And we actually had legislation that we worked on. And the problem with PACE and the problem with
So what's the C, property assessment,
property assessment and energy,
clean energy,
uh,
because there's,
Yeah, big problems with residential, but commercial properties, it makes a lot of sense about this.
yeah.
Madam Chair, can we
Yeah.
get 30 seconds explanation for the principle?
Sure. The concept is that and this was looking at Efficiency Vermont or Efficiency Utility, that they would stand up a PACE program, and that I, as a homeowner, could go to the PACE program and I could borrow funds to make energy efficiency improvement in my home. The difficulty that you run into for us is that it take a priority position in front of the mortgage, and that's a non-starter.
So just to clarify, so say I want to spend $20,000 on making my home really energy efficient, but I'm going to sell it in a year or two. That poses a problem because don't want to take out debt for something that you're going to sell the asset. So a property assessed clean energy project would allow the note to be held against parcel as effectively like a property tax that for the next 20 years, those that own the parcel have to pay it back.
Right.
But it makes a
So
lot
go
of sense.
with
for
the
commercial
parcel.
property.
not the person.
Correct. It goes with the
goes
parcel.
with the
So
parcel.
to transfer on ownership, you buy my house and I've got a 20,000 debt PACE. You have to be willing to accept that. Your lender the lender that you're using to buy the property, at the times in our discussion would say, we're going to have that paid off because we're not going to have that sit in front of the mortgage. And that's part of the challenge, we're going to have in some of the conversations in the building on blighted property, because there's fee discussions that would sit in front of a mortgage. There's discussions about property tax deferments that might be an option for some older homeowners, et cetera, that would sit in front of a mortgage. And for our community, for those secondary market players, I can tell you that's going to have an effect on the availability of capital in the marketplace. All things we need to talk about and figure out how to move forward.
I would hope that if we narrow it enough so that it only is for projects that ultimately reduce the operating costs of the underlying parcel asset,
Yep.
that I think the banks could get more comfortable with
Yep.
it if it's not on luxury things, but instead of things like low or energy bills, so that people paying it off or receiving the benefit of
Right.
lower electricity costs.
And the other thing,
Cost of underwriting and so on associated with all the work that has to be done to validate that.
correct. And the other thing that we've slowly seen progress in is the ability for those to be valued in the appraisal, because that's a challenge. And when the appraisal you make that $20,000 investment and the appraisal comes in and it doesn't reflect that investment or the benefit.
That's the problem with residential parcels, but commercial parcels, the people that know how a spreadsheet works, the pro forma does,
Right.
this usually makes a lot of sense.
But we haven't adopted them commercially here.
But we have not. Now, when the proponents of PACE, at the time, the proponents of PACE were looking at purely the residential side. The commercial side never came up in conversations and haven't until we're sitting here today.
Yeah, and it traveling with the parcel. Because it's an added value to have a more efficient parcel of a property.
I have commercial developer friends.
Yeah.
They want to spend the money to make it's an energy building, but they're just not rewarded for it. It's not valued in the assessment. But what they can do is when they're selling a multi-million-dollar parcel, they can show for the next 20 years that this is going to cost you this much less back in present day dollars, that carrying that note on the parcel, it's easier to swallow. But residential homeowners, it's harder to educate them on this. So it's taken off nationwide for commercial parcels.
Yep.
And banking industries could make some money on it.
Right. Thank
We
you.
do energy efficiency one.
Yeah, no, thank you. Something for us to explore. Anything further for Chris? Any other questions for Chris at this point?
Happy to come back at any time, work with you on any